In the early 19th century, the distance separating two enemy ships during a battle was less than 500 meters. At that distance, the only thing that counted was the number of cannons.
At Trafalgar, there were more than 5,000 cannons facing each other. To reach those numbers, you had to wait till the First World War. You didn't have that many cannons, and they were big ones, 36-pounders, whereas on land, Napoleon, in the same period at Austerlitz, probably had 146 cannons, and they were only 20-pounders. It was another world.
Naval warfare was changing. It was no longer a matter of intimidating your enemy, but annihilating him.
Destruction, the desire to annihilate one's enemy, started to appear in the middle of the 18th century. There were battles that demonstrated how they were trying to sink enemy ships, or even, really, to kill men.
The French fired to demast ships. They sought to immobilize the enemy by aiming at the sails. They made the masts collapse. On the other hand, the English were much more dangerous because they fired to kill. So, they aimed at the level of the ship's rail. The English cannonballs splintered about 1 meter of wood. So the poor French sailors were hit full in the chest or the eyes by these splinters, and the French losses were much greater than the English losses.
In 1779, the English perfected a new artillery weapon which they introduced on their ships a year later. It was called the carronade.
The carronade was a short cannon placed on deck, offering very accurate firing over a short range. It was very destructive. The carronade could easily pierce an enemy's hull, but also fire across the decks.
The carronade, loaded with shrapnel, fired at the enemy decks at less than 300 meters. The results were devastating. The French soon copied it and installed this deadly weapon on their own ships. Whether they were carronades or cannons, a lengthy process was required before these artillery weapons could be fired. First, you had to clean the inside of the barrel to remove any powder from the previous firing. Then the powder charge was inserted. Next, the cannonball, wedged between two wads of old ropes, was compacted in the barrel. The gun was moved close to the gun port using a system of ropes and pulleys. 15 men were needed to manipulate this heavy 3.5-ton gun. Once in position, the gun commander would discharge the powder and light the match cord.
I use the example of a Formula One car coming into the pits to change its tyres. You have to be as quick as possible. Loading a cannon was no different. You had a team around a cannon, and they had to react very fast and be perfectly coordinated. And that coordination only came with practice.
The English were capable of firing a 38-pounder gun in 8 minutes. The less well-trained French took 2 or 3 times longer. Once the cannons were ready, the ship's side had to be positioned towards the enemy.
The commander's task was to maneuver his ship, or even his fleet, if he was an admiral, into a favorable position to fire the first shot. And even to be able to fire a second as quickly as possible, in the knowledge that the ships were moving.
When you have about 30 cannons firing more or less at the same time, first of all, it's very noisy, and then there's a lot of smoke. You can't see the cannon next door. The smoke is overwhelming. You have to try to imagine it. There were about 300 men in a space already saturated with gunpowder. You can't imagine what it was like, but it would burn your throat. There was the heat, of course, the fear, the noise of battle and explosions, because opposite you, the enemy was also firing. And when he hit his target of the enemy gun ports, the wood exploded, which sent splinters and particles whirling about the batteries, striking the men. The wounds show this quite clearly.
In addition to the dead, there were dozens of wounded men. So that the crew wouldn't panic at the sight of so much blood, the decks of some ships were painted red.
The English ships had trained crews, used to very strict discipline, and, if I can put it this way, they were replaceable. They had 3 times more naval reserves than the French did. I think the difference in the late 18th century wasn't so much in technology, but in human resources.
With more sailors but also more ships, England had the most powerful navy in the world. France wanted to make things more equal, and in order to do that, invested in technological advances.
The idea was to equal the quantity and financial resources of Great Britain by technological breakthroughs. France systematically used technological innovation to compensate for financial, economic, and industrial inferiority in comparison to Great Britain.
So Henri-Joseph Pétion, an army general, graduate of the École Polytechnique and French artillery specialist, developed a new weapon, the shell gun. Both shorter and heavier, this gun fired explosive shells.
The explosive shell, firstly, travelled faster, so it was able to smash through the wooden walls, and it exploded inside the battery.
It proved its formidable effectiveness in 1838 in the war between France and Mexico.
Using these shells, France destroyed the fortress of San Juan de Ula. So every navy then understood the threat to wooden navy ships.
While the Pétion gun was quickly adopted by navies, the same wasn't true of the other major invention that would transform warships, steam power.
There was resistance to change. There was a natural skepticism towards new technological breakthroughs. And you could see that with the arrival of steam. Changes in mentalities, ways of thinking, don't happen at the same rate as technological changes. There can be relatively quick technological changes, but then people have to adapt.
The first steam engine was installed in a boat in 1807. With 18 horsepower, it operated 2 enormous paddle wheels.
The invention of steam power was applied at sea by an American, Fulton, giving more power. And he made the first steamboats with a range that made them useful for trade or for war.
In 1838, an English liner powered by both sail and steam made the crossing from Liverpool to New York in a record time, 15 days instead of the 40 days needed by other sailing ships. In spite of this exploit, the great naval powers were slow to adopt steam.
You immediately think, steam, that's it. No. Perfecting it took a very long time. It was complicated. First of all, you needed different types of people on board. You needed mechanics, you needed people who worked in forges, people in the iron trade.
The steam engine was a complicated and delicate mechanism which raised questions over vulnerability and fuel stocks.
For the military use of steam, the major obstacle was the protection of the ship, because the external wheels providing the propulsion were extremely vulnerable to enemy artillery.
But there was another problem. In the holds, they needed enormous stores of coal. So they not only needed space in the holds for that, which was to the detriment of the cannons, but they also needed external infrastructure, places to pick up coal around the world.
Another revolutionary invention solved the problem of vulnerability, the propeller. Located below the waterline, it was protected from enemy fire. It quickly appealed to naval commanders. Every warship is now driven by propeller. It allows them to travel at remarkable speeds. The problem is that they generate considerable noise, which can be picked up by enemy submarines using their sonar.
They have antennae, which try to detect the presence of mechanical objects such as boats among the sounds of the sea. Civilian boats can be detected from far away because their priority isn't to avoid detection by submarines. On the other hand, on the Frem frigate, the hull has been specially designed to limit the noise of water flowing off the hull. The stabilizers have been removed, and a much quieter method of stabilizing the ship is used. The engines obviously have to run, and the pumps cause vibration. All that sound is insulated from the hull in order to reduce the noise emitted by the ship.
Engineers have also worked on the shape of the propeller. Its hydrodynamic qualities make this ship even quieter. It was a French engineer, Stanislas Dupuy de Lome, who designed the first warship in the world to be driven by steam and propeller, the Napoleon. 5 years after its launch, it demonstrated its 500 horsepower in the Crimean War, when the Russian Navy faced the French and English navies.
People understood the usefulness of steam power when the Napoleon gave a tow to the flagship, the Ville de Paris, which wasn't a traditional three-masted ship, so only driven by sail, because there wasn't much wind and the currents were against it. And the British were stuck at the entry to the Dardanelles because they didn't have a sufficiently powerful steamship. It was a brilliant demonstration of the superiority of steam over sail.
This exploit removed the French Navy's reticence with regard to steam power.
In 1855, a committee met and said, a warship that isn't steam-powered isn't a warship. So a page was turned. It didn't mean that all sailing ships were got rid of. But it did mean that people from then on considered that steam was essential to the operation of a warship.
In 1855, a new type of ship was introduced. Continuing its experimentation, France constructed an ironclad platform armed with 50-pounder Paixhan guns. It was called the Floating Battery.
It was called the Floating Battery, as they couldn't call it a frigate or a corvette or anything else, because these were ships with no nautical qualities at all. It was a sort of fortress on water. It was a big ironclad shoebox which fired guns, and that was it. It had no form. It wasn't a ship of the line. It wasn't a ship. Let's be honest about it.
During the Crimean War, 3 floating batteries were towed to face the fortress of Kinburn. On the 17th of October 1855, they reduced the fortress to ashes in 4 hours. For their part, the floating batteries sustained little damage in spite of being hit by 126 shells. This success confirmed the intuitions of the engineer Stanislas Dupuy de Lome.
Dupuy de Lome was a brilliant young naval engineer. He was sent to England several times to observe British technological progress. He was struck by the achievements of the British steel industry, and in 1845 he proposed the idea of an entirely ironclad frigate.
This new type of ship was launched on the 8th of March 1859. It was the first ironclad in the world. Its name was Gloire.
It was a ship that was extraordinarily technologically advanced, such that for about 20 years, France was ahead of England in naval architecture, which was rarely the case. The Gloire marked a break with the past because it was a combination of 3 types of innovation, which were 1. Artillery with exploding shells, 2. Propeller-driven propulsion, and 3. Armour plating.
The Gloire brought to an end 3 centuries of domination by sailing ships, and the age of the ironclad started. These steel warlords would rule the seas until the start of the Second World War. The Gloire was an imposing warship, almost 78 meters long and 17 meters wide. But it was above all a very heavy ship due to its armour plating. 5,630 tons. Plates of wrought iron, 11 centimetres thick, were fixed to its wooden hull. They went all the way round the ship at the level of the waterline. These plates added 844 tons of extra weight. Dupuy de Lome was forced to reduce the weight if he wanted to retain its nautical qualities.
Dupuy de Lome needed to save weight. So, the forecastle and the aft castle disappeared, and you had a continuous deck with all the guns in battery under an armour-plated deck.
Normally, it would have had 2 decks, but with the weight of the armour plating, he had to remove one battery, and that was why it was called an ironclad frigate.
Although fewer than on earlier ships, the guns were much more powerful. The Gloire was armed with 36 shell guns, which were now able to be aimed through almost 180 degrees using a system of rails. In addition to its sails, the ship had a steam engine, which produced more than 2,500 horsepower. With a powerful engine and reduced weight, the ironclad could reach the impressive speed of 13 knots or 25 kilometers per hour. This first ironclad in the world was a successful blend of the floating battery and the ship at the line. Today, the challenge still remains to find the ideal balance between armour plating and nautical qualities.
Armour plating is big, it's heavy, and so it has an impact on speed and range. It's all a matter of compromise. So you armour plate the sensitive parts of the frigate. You can't armour plate the whole of the ship, as they used to do in the past.
The latest generation of frigates have lightweight armour plating, but they're still incredibly strong ships due to their innovative technical design.
The Freme frigate is separated in 2. It's as if you have 2 frigates, one at the front and one at the back. And between these 2 sections of the ship, there's a double dividing wall which isolates the front from the back. If a missile strikes the front, for example, you'll find exactly the same systems at the back, and the ship will be able to continue fighting to a certain extent.
The incredible resistance of today's ships is a legacy from the 19th century. In the late 19th century, ironclads became the capital ships of navies.
The capital ship is the ship around which the whole fleet is organized. The whole fleet exists to showcase this ship, because the idea we have of naval warfare is that the war will be played out at sea in a decisive battle, and from that confrontation, a victor will emerge, and the victor will control the sea.
In order to win the decisive battle, the warring navies engaged in a technological race between armour plating and guns, between shield and sword.
Guns were getting bigger and bigger. You'd have absolutely massive guns which could fire 2 or 3 times in 15 minutes, and in parallel, the protection was increasing.
Steel replaced wrought iron, and the plates became 5 times thicker. The armour plating went up to 1/3 of the total weight of the ship. The problem was that these ironclads were much slower and less manoeuvrable.
One of the solutions was not to armour plate the whole length of the ship, but only the vital parts, to reduce the number of plates to 2 or sometimes 4, which were installed around a sort of fortified castle. That would be in the centre, and you'd have a sort of blockhouse or a dungeon in the industrial style.
On deck, the artillery weapons were first of all protected behind an armour-plated wall, then later integrated into a rotating turret. That technology, perfected by the English in 1869, revolutionized warships.
The invention of the gun turret was a revolution in ship construction which would completely change the appearance of the platforms.
From 1879 onwards, guns were up on deck, and the gun ports disappeared. The form of French warships was getting closer to that of modern ships. All the ingredients were there for the arrival of a new type of ship. But this time, the revolution didn't come from France, but from England, when in 1905 they built the Dreadnought, meaning fearing nothing.
When the Dreadnought came into service, all the ironclads that existed before were named pre-Dreadnought, in order to show that there was a significant break between the ships that existed and this Dreadnought. And the really revolutionary thing about this ship was the fact that it was driven by turbines and went fast. It was well protected and possessed a uniform main battery of heavy caliber guns.
The English had understood before anyone else that this was the age of big guns, with a range of 22 kilometers. The advantage was that they could engage the enemy from as far away as possible with maximum firepower. The aim was to combat a deadly threat, the torpedo.
Torpedoes in the beginning were really almost homemade. Trial and error. They put an explosive charge on the end of a spar on a small motorboat, and then they sailed towards a big ship to make it explode.
This rudimentary weapon was quickly improved. In 1864, the English engineer Robert Whitehead attached a motor to long tubes carrying an explosive warhead. Undetectable, the torpedo moved along, level with the water, and exploded below the armor plating of the ironclad.
And this threat would be realized, strengthened, upgraded in the 1870s with the introduction of the torpedo boat. The torpedo boat was potentially a deadly enemy of the ironclad. It was a small boat with 2, sometimes 4, torpedo tubes. Very fast, very low in the water, with a small hull. And it would approach ironclad ships very fast, launch its torpedoes, and disappear. The only problem at the time was that no one knew how to guide the torpedo, so they had to be launched in the right direction. The torpedo boat had to line itself up for a certain time so that its torpedo would go in the right direction and stay in that direction.
The short range of the first torpedoes meant that torpedo boats had to get close to the target. They were therefore exposed to the Dreadnought's guns. By 1910, fully automatic gun turrets significantly increased firing rates. The shell was placed in a small hoist with the powder charge, transported to the top of the turret and inserted into the gun barrel. This operation could be carried out in less than 1 minute. These turrets were installed on French ironclads from 1911 onwards. Another important but invisible change took place concerning propulsion.
The question of propulsion remained central, with one major development. First of all, the change from coal to oil during the First World War at the instigation of the Royal Navy. Firstly, it offered the possibility of manufacturing more efficient engines, including diesel engines, and it also allowed faster refueling. Refueling with coal was a dreadful chore, which was simplified by the change to oil.
The ironclad was constantly improving in order to keep its supremacy up until the start of the Second World War.
There was a sort of race to build the biggest ships. Ships became heavier and heavier, more and more imposing. So obviously for their propulsion, they needed boilers that were capable of giving sufficient power to drive the boat at speed.
In 1939, France fitted out its most imposing warship, an ironclad 264 meters long, weighing 37,000 tons, the Richelieu.
Forteresse flottante, navire de bataille dans toute l'acception du terme. Le cuirassé abrite sous les plus épaisses cuirasses l'artillerie la plus puissante. Il doit faire front à tous les assauts et décider du destin du combat.
The ship was armed with the biggest guns ever built by France, 380 millimeters diameter.
You have to imagine that a 380mm gun is capable of firing a missile weighing about 1 ton at 900 kilometers per hour muzzle velocity every 1.5 to 2 minutes.
Toutes les minutes 30 ou toutes les 2 minutes.
The ships fighting each other were getting further and further apart. Between the very beginning of the 20th century and the Second World War, the range of naval artillery increased 6-fold, pretty much. So that allowed ships to fight each other from much further away.
But the Second World War sounded the death knell for these colossal ships. With their undersized air defences, they were incapable of withstanding airborne firepower. At Pearl Harbor, the American fleet was decimated by Japanese aeroplanes launched from aircraft carriers a few hours earlier.
With the use of aircraft later, the question of range becomes less relevant. Actually, the factor that will increase the capacity or the length of the ships will be the range of the aircraft. So you'll be fighting each other at distances much greater than ships were able to, up till now.
At the end of the war, the ironclads were dethroned by the aircraft carrier, which became the capital ship. But what about the warships of the future?
There's a real challenge to plan and design a ship for the next 50 years. It takes time to implement any idea, but especially for a weapon system, to be able to operate within a collection of weapon systems. So the Navy is for the long term.
As both firing platform and ship, the warship is one of the most complex technological tools ever designed. The galley, the 74 gunship of the line, and the ironclad have marked the history of France. The aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle and frigates are their worthy successors. In the past, fighting was face-to-face, whereas today, thanks to missiles and combat aircraft, it's possible to destroy targets thousands of kilometers away. This incredible evolution isn't about to stop. Already, engineers and officers are planning the warships of tomorrow.